Well, I'm standing here in sagebrush, and in Wyoming it's a common sight. And while it may seem commonplace, it's actually extremely important for a lot of Wyoming's iconic species. Pronghorn, sage grouse, brewer's sparrow, sage thrasher, these are all creatures that depend and rely on sagebrush and the availability of it. Those species are called sagebrush obligates, meaning that they are obligated to having sagebrush around them. And so this area here is going to be a great spot to find some of these iconic sagebrush species in Wyoming. Well, I'm standing here next to a couple of Wyoming's noxious weeds, and while noxious weeds can provide maybe habitat and food for some of the wildlife species, ultimately, at the end of the day, if it is outcompeting or is bad for the native species that is here, then it's also bad for the wildlife as well. One of the common questions I get is about Russian olive, which has been listed recently as a noxious weed, and I'll get questions about whether or not the benefits of the way that birds will use the Russian olive outweighs the noxious weed part of it. And the answer is always, it's not better to have the habitat for the birds. They will use the Russian olive to eat. They will use it to rest in. But ultimately, it's best for them to have the native species that would be there naturally. So the birds that you see a lot of the times in Russian olive, the waxwings and robins, these are generalists, and these are the type of birds that you're going to find just as happily on any other tree. But what's happening is that Russian olive is taking away habitat for the native species, where some of our very specific birds that have very specific needs, it's taken away their habitat and the plants that they need. So at the end of the day, it is best to get rid of the noxious weeds, no matter how much you think that your wildlife is appreciating them. They'll appreciate it more to have their native species. So as homeowners with acreages around them, as you get closer to the actual house, to the homestead, then you start to want to create sort of more of an intimate habitat for birds and wildlife. The Adams have done a great job here planting some native flowers, which are going to attract birds and butterflies and bees. And next to the house, of course, a lot of owners would like to put up bird feeders. And I think that the best thing to start with bird feeders is to ask yourself, what kind of birds am I trying to attract? If you're trying to attract hummingbirds, in addition to the flowers that you can put out, you can also put out a hummingbird feeder filled with a concoction of usually 4 parts water to 1 part sugar. And a lot of times people want to put red dye into it, but it's really best not to put dye into the hummingbird feeders. So you can put those up if you have hummingbirds in your area. If you have got goldfinches and small seed eaters of that sort, then using the thistle seed, the Niger thistle seed, in one of the stalks is really the best bet for attracting those sorts of birds. If you have got a lot of the chickadees, if you have a lot of evergreens around, you're probably going to get a lot of chickadees and nuthatch species. And for those types of birds, and especially in the wintertime, you want to put out the suet feeders. And those are the kind of cage-looking feeders that you put the fat inside of. Peanut butter also works for those as well, but the suet feeders are best for those types of species of birds. And then for some of your larger nut-eating birds, you're going to probably want to get something like the black oil sunflower seeds, and you can put those in the open feeders. And there's a variety of feeders that you can purchase. And the best bet is to stay away from the mixes that sort of advertise feeding a whole variety of birds. You really want to target the species of birds you're looking for, so that you end up giving them the best nutrition for what they're looking for. But the bottom line, the best thing to do is to do just like what the Adams have done here, and that is to provide native species, wildflowers that they can naturally glean the food that they need to out of. The second part of all of this, they do have nice habitat that they can use for shelter. The second part, of course, is water. And with water, it is good to provide a water source for your bird species, but it's a good idea to make sure you're checking it often. Water left standing can be a huge magnet for mosquito larvae, and that's one thing we definitely don't want to produce a lot of. So if you're going to provide a small source of water for your birds, you want to make sure that you're checking that water quite often to make sure that it's cleaned and it's not harboring anything you don't want it to. And then the last thing that you really want to keep in mind is cats and dogs. We all have them, especially out in the country. The Adamses actually don't have them on this property, and so that's going to give all of the wildlife the free rein to sort of not have to worry about domestic predators. They just have to worry about the natural predators. Cats, it's great if you're going to have them to keep them indoors. They can be enormous predators on wildlife, and so if you're going to go through the trouble of creating a nice wildlife-friendly landscape, then you don't want to create a buffet for your indoor cats as well. So if at all possible, you want to keep your cats indoors. And dogs, the same token, if they tend to be the type of dogs that are chasing and seem to be bothering the wildlife, then again, you may want to keep them indoors as well. So here we are looking at one of the sock feeders for thistle that goldfinch and chickadees and other birds like that tend to like as well. And one of the things to keep in mind when you are putting out your feeders is that if birds find it, then it's probably likely that other animals are going to find it as well. So if you live in an area where there's bears, you certainly don't want to have your feeder out in a time when they are going to be out scrounging for food. You don't want them to figure out that you are providing a food source for them. So if you do live in bear area, you want to take your feeders down during the season that they're out, and you can bring them back out in the wintertime when they're sleeping. Also, other animals that tend to like the feeders are going to be your raccoons and your rodents and things like that. And there's a lot of ways to minimize their availability to the food, and you can find those sources online.